before we get to the questions that you have given us, Dr. Macbeth is going to give us kind of a 101 on immunity and this thing called RNA. So, Mark, without any further ado, to you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Joe, for inviting me to do this. I think it's a really important subject. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to give you basically a 2-year course in biochemistry condensed in 5 to 10 minutes. So buckle up. You probably heard about this vaccine, this new type of vaccine for the coronavirus, or that causes COVID. It's an RNA vaccine, uses RNA technology. And so in order to, explain some facts about this vaccine, I thought I would step back and explain to you what RNA is and what it does, how it's used as a vaccine, and how we're going to develop this vaccine to prevent infection from the coronavirus that causes COVID. So you may all have heard of DNA. DNA is the instruction manual, basically, for who you are, for who we are. We all have a unique DNA sequences. Our siblings and relatives have some overlapping DNA. It's why I sort of look like my brother Joe. It doesn't account for hair length or personal choices like this, but it does account for hair color, face shape, height, all of these other sort of characteristics that we might have in common. And so DNA is written in a special code, and that code has to be transmitted to a protein. Okay, so the DNA basically is the language that we are using to define who we are, but that language has to be translated into proteins, because proteins are basically doing all the work and the functional molecules. That translation is done by another type of molecule called RNA. So that flow of information from DNA to protein goes through an RNA intermediate, where RNA basically acts as the translator. It translates that DNA language into the language of a protein. And humans are very complex organisms, complicated. We have more than 10,000, probably closer to 20,000 different DNA sequences that are encoded by our genes that make us who we are. And each of those genes encode a specific protein, and it goes through that translation process for which RNA is used to translate them. So we have 20,000 genes making 20,000 different proteins. The coronavirus is very clever. It bypasses that DNA. It doesn't store all of its genes in DNA, it stores them in RNA. So it already is translated. So when we're infected by a coronavirus, we don't have to go through that translation process to translate that coronavirus gene into a coronavirus protein. It's already an RNA molecule. Also, coronavirus is very clever. It can survive with only 30 genes. It's very simple, right? There's 30 different RNA sequences that make about 30 different proteins, okay? But it needs all of those proteins, all 30 of them, to make a new virus and to go on and to infect, spread to somebody else, to basically make a copy of itself. So it needs all 30 of them. And this is where the vaccine comes in. The vaccine, again, it's sort of a very simple type of vaccine. And when we compare to other types, you'll see why. The vaccine is basically one of those coronavirus sequences, one of those RNA sequences of the coronavirus. So it has the instructions for just one of those coronavirus proteins, and that protein is called the spike protein. The spike protein is on the surface of the virus. It's these little studs that you see in all of the pictures of the virus, and on this one here, it's those little black circles that are on the coat of the virus. And so when we're given an injection in the arm, a shot in the arm of this vaccine, of this RNA, that RNA goes into our cells, where it is then copied into that coronavirus protein. So we're not getting injected with the entire coronavirus. We're just getting injected with that instructions for that one spike protein. And we're missing the other 29 instructions to make the rest of the virus. Okay, so that's really important. And that's one of the reasons why we're not going to get coronavirus when we're injected with this vaccine. We don't have the instructions for the entire virus. We just have the instructions for that one spike protein. Okay, and so again, we get that shot. Our cells start making that spike protein, but then what happens next? And then go to the next slide, John. So when we start making that spike protein, that's when our immune response kicks in. When we're infected with a coronavirus, that spike protein goes into our system and we start an immune response against it. The same thing happens when we're injected with that RNA for that spike protein. We start making that spike protein and the immune response kicks in. The body is almost tricked into thinking that we were exposed to the actual virus, but we weren't. We were just exposed to just that spike protein, but we were exposed intentionally, okay? Again, completely safe because we're missing the instructions for the rest of the coronavirus. Okay, and so when we talk about the immune response that kicks in against the spike protein, we have two types of immunity. We have one type called innate immunity. This is the immediate response. The body immediately recognizes that, hey, something doesn't belong here. We don't normally make this spike protein. We need to get rid of it. Okay, that is not human, right? It's not, a host. And so the innate immune response kicks in immediately to try and destroy this or to ward this infectious protein off, this particle, this spike protein. And so that happens right away. And it's basically the body throwing the kitchen sink at this spike protein. And it's responsible for all of our symptoms. And so when we feel that soreness in the arm, if we feel a little feverish or a little achy when we get this injection, that's because of this innate immune response kicking in. Okay? It's kicking in the same way it would kick in if we were actually exposed to the virus. All of those symptoms we feel when we get an infection, a stuffy nose, a fever, aches and pains, a soreness, or a headache, that's all due to the innate immune response. So when you feel those side effects from a vaccination, that means the vaccine is working. It means your body is making that spike protein from that RNA from the coronavirus, and your immune response is starting to fight it off. Okay, so that's the innate immune response, and again, it's immediate. It's within a day of getting that injection. The next point, though, is the adaptive immune response, and this is key for immunity and preventing reinfection in a later date. And so the adaptive immune response, it kicks in 3 to 4 weeks after you are exposed. Okay, this is after the innate immune response. And the key player in the adaptive immune response is an antibody. And an antibody is a protein, one of our own proteins now, that will recognize the foreign protein, that spike protein on the coronavirus. And it's going to target it for destruction, but it's going to do it very, very specifically now. Those antibodies are only recognizing that spike protein, and they're not recognizing anything else. So it's very specific, and it takes 3 to 4 weeks for this to happen. So in addition to targeting the spike protein for destruction, it's sending signals to other immune cells to start making more of that antibody. So you can build up a reserve of them. So that is, if you're ever re-exposed at a later date, you'll have some antibodies ready to put up a fight right away, and you won't get sick. Okay? So those antibodies will respond right away when you're re-exposed, 3 or 4 months down the road, and ward off that infection in a very specific and very potent way. And so this is responsible, this is what we call immunity, when we are immune to a virus or a disease, because we've built up these antibodies. So in addition to having these antibodies around, our cells that make them, they also remember how to make them. So we can have this immunity that could last for years and years. And so immunity to measles, if you had a measles vaccine, that can last up to 70 years because our cells that make those antibodies remember how to do that. So if we're ever re-exposed to a measles virus, we can make those antibodies right away and fight off that infection. Not all vaccines last for 70 years. Tetanus lasts for 10 years. The flu vaccine, because the flu changes so quickly, and we'll talk about changes in new strains of virus later, the flu vaccine, because it changes so quickly, it lasts for about 1 year. Okay? So that's the innate and the adaptive immune response. Both of them are key players in the vaccination and developing immunity. But the last concept I want to talk about is this idea of herd immunity. And herd immunity is defined by the Center for Disease Control as a situation where a large enough percentage of the population is immune to an infectious disease. And that makes it spread to non-immune individuals or susceptible individuals unlikely. And I like to think of this as an analogy, right? So think about a calf that's part of a herd, and that herd is going to be attacked by a predator. What the herd does, the adults in the herd, they will surround the calf to protect it because the calf can't fight off the predator on its own. The same idea happens with herd immunity, is that you have a population of individuals that are immune that are serving to protect those that are not immune. And this works because a virus needs a host to copy itself and to spread to somebody else. But if enough of the population is immune, that virus can't get a foothold and spread to other individuals, and it eventually dies out. And we've seen this happen. A perfect example of this is smallpox. The smallpox virus has basically been eradicated because of herd immunity. We went on a huge vaccination program was developed to vaccinate everybody in the world to develop this herd immunity, right? So now the virus had nowhere to go, and it just basically went extinct. It died off. And so that's what we're trying to establish with this coronavirus vaccine. We want to get enough of the population immune so the virus can no longer get a foothold and spread to other individuals, right? It just doesn't have anywhere to go. Okay, so again, that was a lot of information thrown at you. Hopefully it sort of set the table for what this vaccine is about. You get a little bit about RNA, you get a little bit about the immune response. We're happy to take your questions about safety and other issues regarding this vaccine. So I'll turn it back to you, John.
Mark, thank you. My goodness, thank you for encapsulating, 2 years of study into 10 minutes. These calendars, I think maybe you want to address these now, or do you want to wait?
Yeah, I can talk about them right now. So one of the questions, and it may come up, but I'll deal with it now. One of the common questions that we're getting is once I get the vaccine, when will I be protected, right, from the coronavirus? And so you can see here, it's if the vaccine was administered on the first day of the month, you are still very susceptible for about 2 weeks. Okay, so do not mess around. Keep your distance. Keep your masks on. But after about 2 weeks, you're going to start. You'll feel those side effects. You might feel a sore arm. But after about those 2 weeks, you're going to start making those antibodies that are going to build up, and they're going to start to protect you from reinfection. And they start after about 3 weeks or so. You start making those. Okay. After about a month, you should have plenty of them. And what's going to help that is getting a booster shot of after about 3 weeks, I believe it is, for one of them, for one of the RNA vaccines. So you'll get your first shot. About 3 weeks later, you'll get a second shot. And then that should set you up for a while. We don't know how long yet, but you should be protected after about a month. One of the questions that also comes up is, why do you need a second shot? And this comes up with, it sort of deals with the beauty of the RNA vaccine. Not only is it simple and safe, RNA by itself is, and having worked with it for so long, RNA is just not very stable. And that makes it very challenging to work with, right? And very frustrating, but it also makes it a great vaccine, because when you're injected, that RNA is going to degrade within a day or so. The spike proteins that are going to be made from it, they're going to last a little bit longer, long enough for you to make those antibodies. But because that RNA is so unstable, you're going to get another booster after about 3 weeks. to just sort of, charge up the system again. Here's another shot of RNA. Why don't you telling your body to make more of that coronavirus spike protein so you can sort of shore up the production of those antibodies. Okay. And that instability of the RNA, it makes it a great vaccine. It doesn't affect your DNA. Once that DNA was copied to RNA, that's sort of a one-way street. So you don't have any worries about that. But also you may have heard that this vaccine needs to be stored at very cold temperatures, minus 80 degrees, frozen, deep frozen. That's because of the stability of the RNA. It's just not very stable, and it needs to be stashed away at these ultra cold temperatures to make it last a little bit longer. So give it about a month where you should see this 94 to 95% effectiveness.